The Eiger, a 3,967 meter high mountain, about 13,051 feet, makes up a part of the Bernese Alps in Switzerland. Its most notable feature is its north face that starts about halfway up the mountain. In the context of mountains, in the northern hemisphere, north-facing slopes are the coldest, most difficult and dangerous side of a mountain to climb. The history of Eiger's north face is marked by both daring ascents and tragedies. Mordwand, or murder wall. The nickname given to the northern face of Eiger is a play on the German word for north face, or Nordwand. 64. The number of climbers that have lost their lives attempting this formidable face. The northern face of Eiger is a testament to the power and beauty of nature. The base of the north face begins at around 2,103 meters, or 6,900 feet up Mount Eiger. If climbing the north face of Eiger from the face's base to the summit, climbers are met with a vertical wall of rock that is over 1,800 meters or 5,900 feet high. This sheer vertical wall of rock commands respect and awe in equal measure. Its sheer cliff faces, riddled with cracks and crevices, stand as a daunting challenge to even the most seasoned climbers. The rock, weathered by centuries of wind and ice, forms a labyrinth of ridges and cracks with no easy path to the summit. But it's not just the physical obstacles that define this ascent. The Eiger is notorious for its unpredictable weather, with sudden storms and avalanches posing constant threats to those brave enough to venture onto its slopes. But despite the dangers, the allure of the Eiger's northern face continues to draw adventurers from around the world, each one seeking to test their limits and conquer one of the most iconic mountains on Earth. Right below the Eiger's north face is an observation point by the Kleine Scheide railway station, where tourist and media attention has always been fueled by the agonies of young men slowly dying a short yet uncrossable distance away. On Saturday, July the 18th, 1936, 4 climbers were already on the face. 2 Austrians,
Edi Reiner, Willi Angerer,
and 2 Germans,
Toni Kurz,
and
Andreas Hinterstoisser.
Will was the oldest at 31 and Andreas, the youngest, at just 21. They were all young men seeking the coveted title of being the first to summit the northern face of Eiger. By Tuesday, 3 days later, all 4 had already climbed as high as Max and Karl the year before. At about 1,200 meters or 3,937 feet from the base of the north face, Max and Karl had set up a bivouac or temporary shelter for night 5 of their climb. Then the weather got worse, and the 2 German climbers could not be seen through the clouds. A few days later, the weather finally cleared, revealing a completely white north face. Karl's frozen body was found in an area now known as the Death Bivouac. A year later, the body of Max was finally found by his brothers. From the perspective of most onlookers at the observation point, Eddie, Willie, Tony, and Andreas were the epitome of exceptional climbers. They had so far witnessed the 4 traverse the exceptionally challenging mountain with ease. However, to the keener observers, there had been a noticeable decrease in their pace over the last 2 days. One of the climbers, apparently Willie, had been struck by a stone on the head 2 days earlier. It was this and worsening weather conditions that finally convinced the group to abandon their climb. Their descent would be one over ice fields and rock cliffs, swept by fallen stones and avalanches, which they had to do while attending to their injured member Will. This marked the start of a slow descent in increasingly challenging conditions. Cutting through Mount Eiger is the Jungfraujoch Railway. As the highest railway in Europe, it runs for 9 kilometers connecting Kleine Scheide mountain pass at 2,061 meters or 6,762 feet to a neighboring mountain pass at 3,454 meters or 11,332 feet. Being above the perennial snow line, the railway is protected from snow and extreme weather by a tunnel built into the Eiger and its neighboring mountain. Along with restaurants, shops, and hiking trails, tourists that visit the area can take a ride on the train and disembark at one of its stations for a short time to observe the neighboring mountains through windows built in the mountainside. There are also access doors built in the tunnel that give access to the face of the mountain itself. One of those stations, specifically Eigerwand Station, is located within Eiger's north face. Stationed in Eigerwand was Albert von Eyman, sector guard on the railway. Hearing of the four climbers' predicament, he opened a massive, bolted door from within the mountain. With the door open, he was met with a steep drop, icy surfaces, and the haunting echoes of snow avalanches. The face looked terrifying, and knowing that there were climbers currently on it, it was even more terrifying. Not wanting to slip or get hit by a fallen rock, he kept a safe distance, and with a deep breath, von Eyman shaped his hands around his mouth, leaned his head back, and shouted upwards, then listened, then shouted again. He was greeted by the voices of the four climbers. They must have been shocked at first, but Ayman soon heard sounds of shouting and yodeling from above. The four were still in high spirits, and judging from the sound, they were no more than 400 feet or 120 meters above him. In between their shouts and yodels, they told von Ayman that all is well, and they were climbing straight down. He let them know that he would start making tea. Von Eyman later recounted going back through the gallery door with a smile on his face to his shelter inside the mountain, adding a kettle of tea to the fire. The four climbers were exhausted, injured, maybe even frostbitten, but alive and happy. Eyman remembered being slightly annoyed at how long it took the kettle to heat up, with his guests arriving any minute now. But long after the tea was ready, they had not come. Early in the month, in the beginning of July, two Austrians, Willie, 31, and Eddie, 27, arrived and set up tent at the base of the North Face of Eiger. The North Face to them was the last great alpine problem. Long-term friends and both proven climbers that were especially good on rock, they immediately started to chart their ascent up the 1,800 meter high or 5,900 feet of vertical rock. Scaling Eiger Mountain, while difficult, had already been done multiple times through its other routes. It was the north face of the mountain that remained unconquered, and that is what the two set their sights on. The first 250 meters or 800 feet of the climb was steep and exposed to fallen avalanches and stones, which looked hard but not impossible to climb. Through binoculars, they noted the holes in the rock, windows of Eigerwand Station, on the railway that snaked upward into the heart of the mountain. Above the railway window on the face, a vertical rock step went surging up for more than 600 feet. Above the step gleamed an ice field, the first ice field, as it is now called. Above that, again, a second rock pitch, followed by a huge sheet of snow and ice, which one would have to ascend diagonally to the left. Then, there was a third ice field. Reaching the top of this ice field, the climbers would have to climb a sharp rock leaning against the perpendicular summit wall. At that point, a ridge, christened the Flat Iron by its climbers. From the ridge, one would have to traverse leftwards across that steep third ice field, which ends with an abrupt ramp surging diagonally to the left across the face towards the Mittelegi Ridge. Could it be climbed to the summit? Was there a path on the right on the huge snowfield that resembled a huge white spider? Could someone climb the spider to the summit through the cracks above? These were all questions the two might have asked themselves, because so far, the North Face remained unclimbed. During Max and Carl's fatal attempt the previous year, the two had spent a long time on the early section of the North Face. Will and Eddie had read all about the previous two's attempts. With that in mind, on Monday, July the 6th, 1936, Will and Eddie started up the face and successfully opened a route up the lower part of the face, reaching just below the Red Rock Face, a smaller peak on the mountain, where they rested for the night. It was the wet and icy conditions the next morning on the 7th that forced them down. The two reached their tents soaking wet, cold and tired, but safe and sound. They would go back up again when the weather improved. What did the wall look like at the moment? A magazine article written by famed Swiss climber on July 8, 1936, described the conditions at the mountain. The weather has been unpredictable with heavy snowfall and cold days. Snow covers the lower parts of the face and the two large ice shields above the Eigerwand station. In the early morning, when the snow has refrozen after being softened by evening sunshine, climbers can safely kick steps without using an ice axe. However, this snow lacks solid glaciation, meaning it isn't firmly consolidated with the old snow underneath. This increases the risk of avalanches. Higher up, near the almost vertical summit, the snow is plastered onto rocks like swept debris. In between, there's water ice formed from melting water that flows down from the mountain's massive snow roof. As long as water ice hangs from the summit's structure, the entire face is at risk of ice falls. You might even see whole torrents of ice coming down and craters formed by them in the snow. 10 days later, on Saturday, July the 18th, 1936, the two ropes of Willie and Eddie and Andreas and Tony started up the face. At first they moved independently, but once they reached the bivouac previously occupied by the Austrians during the test run, they decided to rope up as one group. Tony, 23, and Andreas, 21, were childhood friends and both serving in the German military. Despite their age, the two had already made many first ascents in the Alps, including some of the most difficult climbs of the time. It was in July that the two decided to bicycle to Switzerland from Germany to attempt the then unclimbed Eiger North Face. With all the reporters and articles surrounding the climb, the fresh-faced, clean-cut Tony was loved by everyone. He was a professional mountain guide, having executed many mountain rescues himself. When Tony laughed, it was as if life itself was laughing with him. They reached and climbed the exceptionally severe crack below the red face rock successfully. Above it, Andreas Hinterstoicer was the first to achieve the traverse to the first ice field. It was this kind of traverse that only Andreas could do. He had discovered the key to the climb, cleverly traversing a slab of icy rock by climbing up on it and lowering himself to execute a pendulum to the other side. He then secured the rope that enabled his companions to cross the impassable section. This section of the climb became known as the Hinterstoicer Traverse. When they all came across the impassable section, he retrieved the traversing rope. The path down behind them was now locked if they wished to retreat. But at that moment, none of them were thinking of retreating. From here on, the four mountaineers formed a rope team, meaning they were linked together by a safety rope. A rope team ensures the climbers are securely connected to one another, reducing the risk of accidental falls for individual members. But in some cases, a fall can take the whole team down. In glacier crossings and on easier terrain, climbers can make the route purely by being roped together without using an anchor point. When climbing or in steep terrain, climbers secure the rope to fixed points in the rock or ice. There was speed and confidence in their movement crossing the first ice field. They climbed up beyond it and reached the barrier between it and the second greater ice slope. But something happened. Suddenly, Will and Eddie were following the other two at a slow pace, hesitation in their movement. What happened? The warmth of the rising sun had loosened the rock that fell and hit Will on the head. The pair eventually stopped moving. Eddie supported Will, waiting for Tony and Andreas to let rope down from the rocks above the red rock face. Will then climbed up, then Eddie followed quickly, not needing the use of the emergency rope. For now, they were safe from rock falls. On Sunday the 19th of July, on the second day of their climb, a big crowd had gathered at the observation point below. They saw the four men exit their bivouac and start their climb at 7 in the morning. Will must have been feeling better because they continued. They started their climb across the huge slope of the second ice field. It may have been at a slower pace, but they were now a team, and Tony and Andreas never thought of abandoning Eddie behind with the injured Will. Likewise, Will and Eddie didn't want to rob the others a chance of summiting the North Face. The conditions on the face were not great, but also not bad. The climb was still possible. By the end of this Sunday, the group reached the third ice field, a little below the Death Bivouac, where Max and Carl were last seen the year before. However, despite the four climbing all day, they had not gained the height needed to guarantee a successful push for the top the next day. The space they bivouacked was tiny, with hardly enough room to sit down. They spent another night on the mountain. The day after was Monday, July 20th. Movement was seen at the bivouac at 7 in the morning, as usual. Just like yesterday, Tony and Andreas took the lead, starting the climb on the steep ice slope leading to the Death Bivouac. After 30 minutes, they stopped and started talking to each other. The two Austrians were not following them. The bitter decision was made to turn back. Will was no longer able to follow, and getting him down could be a matter of life and death. The two Germans returned to the bivouac. Sitting and discussing their decision with the remaining two, they all began to descend. For Tony and Andreas, a human being was more important than ascending the mountain. They all began to descend together. With care and assurance, they tied rope and tended to their wounded comrade. They crossed the great slope of the second ice field relatively quickly, but descending the rock step on the doubled rope took several hours to accomplish. Night fell as they reached the lower ice field. Their clothing was wet. The weather was cold. They were exhausted. They camped their third night on the face. The night spent here would only drain their strength even more. They had only managed to come down 300 meters or 1,000 feet, and a full 900 meters or around 3,000 feet of the north face was below them. However, once they passed the Hinterstoicer, traversing the difficult crack, they would be closer to the safety of the valley. It was that part of the wall that they had already climbed up. But that traverse. The next morning, Tuesday, July 21st, all 4 men could be seen by the observers descending the ice slope to the start of the Hinterstoicer traverse. The worst danger from fallen stones would be over as soon as they crossed. Will stayed a bit behind as the others attempted crossing the traverse. It was Andreas himself in the lead. Over the past days, the temperatures dropped. The melted snow and ice pouring down the face had frozen back to ice. Taking the rope after traversing had proved detrimental. Their way down was cut off. Nobody could move over the glassy ice overlaying the rock, not even Andreas himself. Precious time and energy was wasted on impossible, exhausting, and incredibly dangerous attempts to cross the gap at the traverse. They discussed and came to the same conclusion. The only way off was to climb straight down the vertical face, at this point close to 1,000 meters or around 3,200 feet above the base of the north face. When I say vertical, I do mean vertical, with many sections below them bulging far out beyond the mountainside and overhanging into empty air, not to mention the high risk of stones and avalanches. They would descend in a pitch that took Max and Carl a day to climb the year before, and that was in fine weather and on dry rock. They began to get the ropes ready for the descent through thin air, using a technique known as the body rappel. This non-mechanical abseiling technique involves using a double rope, which is basically just a rope folded in half to make it stronger. They prepared. This abseiling technique involved passing a doubled rope between the legs, behind one thigh, crossing up the chest, and over the opposite shoulder. From behind the shoulder, the rope goes diagonally across the back to the braking hand. Their bodies will provide the friction for them to rappel down. When the rope is placed under load, the free hand is held forward to maintain balance, and the braking hand controls the movement of the rope. This lets the rope move when the braking hand is backward and stop movement when the braking hand moves forward. This was of course before the invention and use of a belay device. This small mechanical contraption attaches a harness on the climber to the rope and acts as a friction brake so that when the climber falls with any slack in the rope, the fall is brought to a stop. With the right belay device, a smaller, weaker climber can easily arrest the fall of a much heavier partner. It was soon after that they heard Albert von Eimann's shouts coming up from below. A feeling of relief on the cold and dangerous mountainside could be heard in the team's response. They all joined in yodeling back. All's well, they said. But was it really? 2 hours had passed since Albert had spoken to the climbers, and there was still no movement at the entrance. Could they have climbed down past it? Could they have missed the ledge, which runs across the window? The sector guard went back to the door. His visibility was restricted. Mist clouded his vision and the air was thick with the sound of stones and avalanches. Albert shouted for the men. He got a chilling response in return. Help! The others are dead. I'm the only one alive. Shouting for his life, it was Tony, a guide that had rescued many on the mountain, the sole survivor of the group. The loud sound of the wind, avalanches, and falling rocks made it impossible to get more information on what happened. Albert called the station below asking for guides to rescue the man left on the murder wall. The railway provided a train and soon enough 3 guides stepped onto the face through the gallery door. They climbed diagonally over the slippery ledges until they were 90 meters or 300 feet below Tony, who was above them hanging from a rope tied around him. He heard his rescuers and answered them. He was the only one alive. Andreas came off and fell the whole way down. The rope pulled Eddie up against the snapling. He froze to death there. And Will was dead too, hanging below him, strangled by the rope when he fell. During the retreat from the wall, due to injuries suffered by Will and the severe weather, Andreas could not recross the traverse to safety because the group had previously removed the rope that had helped them cross. They decided to abseil down the vertical rock to its base. Contact was made with the railway guard halfway down the descent. They told him that everything was alright. Then tragedy struck. Andreas, setting up the rope for their last stage of descent, had unclipped himself from the group's safety rope when an avalanche came down the mountain. Andreas's anchor became dislodged, causing him to fall to his death. His body would be found at the bottom of the mountain days later. Will, who was climbing below Tony, was struck by a fallen boulder, dying instantly, and causing his body to fall and catch at the end of the running line where it remained suspended. With a rope wrapped around his body to repel, Eddie, the climber who had been securing the other 2, was violently pulled against the wall by the weight of Will's body. Eddie was struck in the face by a dislodged anchor, shattering his jaw and entangling Eddie where he died minutes later of asphyxiation. Tony, now the only surviving climber, remained suspended by a single rope sling, with a cliff wall out of reach. They were here to help. Tony knew that, telling them that they would have to come from above to the right, up through the crack where the team had left metal pylons on the way up. They would have to descend from there on doubled rope. To the rescuers, this was impossible. The ice made it impossible. Tony still insisted that they could not rescue him from below. Never mind that, the evening was approaching, and any aid was out of the question in the dark. They had to return to the doors while the light was still out. When Tony heard this, his response came back in terrifying shouts of no. They told him to hang on, knowing that he might not make it through the night. They would be back in the morning. They could hear his pleading shouts all the way down to the door. His shouts of despair said it all. Take a moment to imagine the psychological and physical state of anyone in this situation. It was so cold that the water thawed by the warmth of his body froze again immediately. Icicles 8 inches long formed on the points of the spiked crampons strapped to his boots. Tony had lost his mitten from his left hand. His fingers, his hand, then his arm froze into a shapeless, immovable lump. Despite the fearsome cold and volleys of stone, he survived the night, swinging backwards and forwards in his rope sling. When the rescuers returned early morning, he was still responsive. An extra guide had joined the rescue team, and the rescue began. The rocks were covered with ice. It was almost impossible for them to climb. Even though Tony continued to insist on rescue from above, he was asking for the impossible. Even Andreas, in his full and unimpaired strength, could not have climbed the crack in such conditions. All Tony needed was another rope to rope himself down. All efforts to throw the rope up failed. They even tried attaching the rope to small rockets. These went shooting past Tony and too far out the face. However, the 4 guides successfully reached a point only about 40 meters or 130 feet below where Tony was hanging on the rope. Here the rock overhung into the air above them so far they could no longer see him. He needed another rope to get himself down to safety. The 4 men below asked Tony to let a line down so that they could attach a rope, rock pylons, and anything else he needed, which he could pull up, but he didn't have a line. There was, however, a solution. There was still rope that was holding up Will's body. If he could climb down and cut away the body, and climb back up again, and cut the upper part connected to the rock pylon, the length of rope could then be untwisted and joined to his current rope for a longer line down. Strokes of an axe were heard a little while later. Tony held onto the rope with one frozen hand and swung the axe with another. He cut the rope that connected Will to the safety anchor, but Will's body didn't fall. It was frozen solid to the rock. Climbing up, he cut the rope at the anchor point and had in his hand a 7.5 meter or 25 foot length of stiffly frozen rope, and then began the unbelievable work of untwisting the strands. Every climber knows how difficult that is, even on firm ground, with 2 healthy hands. But Tony was suspended in midair on an ice-covered cliff with a thread of fallen rocks and snow around him. At about 850 meters or 2,800 feet from the base of the North Face, he worked with one hand and his teeth for 5 whole hours. Below Tony, the guides were not having a great time either. An avalanche fell, narrowly missing the rescue team. A huge rock later fell right by them, and then a body. It wasn't Tony's though. Will's unfrozen body hurtled down the mountainside. Throughout it all, Tony was agonizingly fighting for his life. The rescue team could only wait. When finally the line came swinging down from above, the rescue team attached the rope, pylons, snap links, and a hammer. He barely managed to pull up the line, but the rope they sent up still was not long enough. They sent up a second rope. It took him an hour to set up the anchor and tie the ropes together. A sling tied around his waist and legs was attached to the rope that he had just let down with a metal snap link. This allowed him to slowly rappel down the newly tied rope as it passed through the link. 40 meters or 130 feet below him were his rescuers. He inched his way down. 6 meters, 13, 18, 23 meters down, 30 meters, 36 meters. At 36 meters or 120 feet, his legs could be seen dangling below the overhang. It was at this point that he stopped moving. The junction knot had jammed in the snap link. The knot Tony used to connect the final rope to his rope was too big for the snap link. The rescuers started yelling and shouting words of encouragement to the exhausted man. Despite only being 3 meters or 10 feet above them at this point, they still could not reach him. With the last of his strength, he made one final effort to force the knot through the link. It was just a single knot. By this point, Tony's arm was frozen useless, sticking out stiff and helpless from his body. His handsome young face was now almost fully purple and frostbitten. He began to lose consciousness. In a desperate attempt to try and reach him, one of the guides climbed on another's shoulders, able to touch the tip of Tony's crampons with the head of his ice axe, but not any higher. Tony then leaned forward, maybe trying to use his teeth on the rope for a final time. Then he spoke clearly, the words, "I can't go on anymore." His body tipped forward. The sling was just out of reach of the rescuers, lifeless. His body then slowly swung away from the mountainside, hanging in thin air. On Saturday, July the 18th, the day that the force started their climb, a phone call was made to the facilities at Mount Eiger. Colonel R. Conrad, Tony's and Andreas's commanding officer, knowing the dangers of the climb, his order for the two was to not make any attempt on Eiger. Tony and Andreas had started up the face a few hours before the colonel had made the call.